program here. My life has been impacted by my global connections in such a huge way. I always wanted to travel around the world, and I worked in Alaska for a summer to raise money. I married Alexandra Gerasimides, who was the daughter of two folks that fled the Civil War in Greece after World War II. So I really appreciate global connections and what you guys are doing. So you kind of put that together with our compassion. I was raised, most of our moms taught us about compassion, right? It's like they teach us about kindness and love, and should just be nice to people because that's the way it's supposed to be. And so that's informed a lot of the work that we've done here in our city. And when I first talked about compassion as a city value along with health and lifelong learning, people are like, man, that makes you sound so weak. And what we know is that really it takes a lot more strength to be compassionate toward people than it is to be skeptical or fight or whatever it is that you want to do, because there's no way forward with fight or through the gun or through weapons. It has to be through mutual understanding and compassion. So my goal has always been to encourage the people of our city to follow their best instincts, to be compassionate, and for helping others lift each other up. And it's easy to be compassionate when you know your neighbors and you've learned about them and their life experiences. It's really isolation from people that are different than you are that leads to most of the trouble, discrimination, and prejudices, and misunderstanding that people have in life. So one of the first things that I did when I became mayor was create the Office for Globalization in 2011 so people could learn more about the world. And then we wanted to welcome the world to Louisville as well. And most all of our population growth is coming from our foreign-born population. It makes Louisville a much more interesting city, a much more dynamic and entrepreneurial city as well. So I'm really grateful to our immigrants, our refugees, our foreign-born population, and encourage them to do one thing: ask their brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews to move to Louisville. So that we can grow as a city and be even more interesting. Now, among them are many Ethiopian families in our community, many of whom have written to me about the uncertainty they feel as relatives face insecurity as a result of the conflict in Tigray. And these are heartbreaking communications because, at the end of the day, we all know what we have, and it's our family. And to have somebody that's thousands and thousands of miles away and you just don't know what's happening to them or is going to happen to them, it's only natural that you're going to have a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma as a result of that. So I just want everybody to know that I, along with the city of Louisville, stand in solidarity with everybody that's being impacted by this crisis. And it's good to see our President Biden, call for an end to the abuses and work to provide assistance to the millions and millions of displaced people. And it's just super important that we have programs like this to create global awareness and a heightened sense of compassion for folks. And it's programs like this that provide us with the opportunity to hear stories shared by our local Louisvillians as they humanize the experiences that we often only hear about in the media, and you don't think about the people that are in the middle of this. I talked about my wife at the beginning of this, and her grandfather was a colonel in the Greek army, and as they went off to fight the Civil War, her grandmom and their kids, one of which was my mother-in-law, Yaya, we call her, the rebels would come out of the mountains into the villages and basically terrorize the families that had been left. And it was primarily women and kids. And they would go into my mother-in-law's house, and they would see the pictures on the wall of the family, and they would rip off the heads of the men and the boys and saying, we're going to come and we're going to kill them. And off they would go. And it's that type of trauma that is happening in way too many parts of the world right now. And that obviously makes a huge impact on you when that happens to you, that nobody should have to endure. And that's what I'm sure we'll be talking about here today. So I thank our Ethiopian community here in Louisville for being such an important part of the fabric of Louisville. I want to thank our Office for Globalization, Sabine, Nassim, and Amos are doing a tremendous job. And I want to thank the World Affairs Council also for hosting this event today. And I also want to thank the United States Institute of Peace as a national, nonpartisan, independent institute that's dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We can never believe that this is an impossible dream. Next week will be the 5th year mark since we lost Muhammad Ali, since he passed away. So he's a great model for us as a humanitarian. And so when we think things are impossible, let's keep in mind one of Muhammad's most famous quotes. And it's quotes about what he said about impossible. So many of you all have probably heard this before, but it's always good to rehear. And Muhammad said, impossible is just a word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world that they've been given than to explore the power they have to change it. Impossible is not a fact. It's an opinion. Impossible is potential. Impossible is temporary. Impossible is nothing. And I know sometimes it feels like it's overwhelming, but we can do it. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to say hello today, and I look forward to listening and learning from the program. Take care.
Thank you, Mayor Fisher, for those inspiring words and sharing that personal experience and connecting our program. It's a great start to this program, and we just also appreciate all of the local community leaders that's here joining us as a panel. So before I turn over to our moderator, Amos, who's the program manager at the Office for Globalization, I just want to let everybody know a few reminders. This webinar is recorded and we are live streaming it on our Facebook page. We will have about 40 minutes of a conversation, and it will be followed by a Q&A. We encourage everyone to, submit your questions at any time during this program via the Q&A function. Some of you have also submitted questions ahead of time, and Amos will be picking them up as we go. You can also share your comments in the chat, and we encourage that, but we just ask that you do so respectfully. And now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Amos to go ahead and start us off. All yours.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Mayor Fisher, for those remarkable words and reminding us about the compassion that we are all working to create in our city and all over the world. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and specifically for our speakers who have agreed to come and help us learn about this conflict that's unfolding and that's happening right now, and for the community members who have agreed to share their personal experiences and how they are being affected by the conflict. I want to welcome our guests, Susan Stigent, who is the Director for Africa Programs at the United States Institute of Peace. She oversees programming in South Sudan, Nigeria, Sudan, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, and Kenya, and with the African Union. Her thematic focus is on the design and implementation of inclusive constitutional reform and national dialogue processes. She has and continues to advise government officials and civic society actors on inclusive processes in Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and elsewhere. She also serves as co-chair of USIP's National Dialogue Working Group. Prior to joining USIP, Susan managed constitutional development, citizen engagement, and election observation programs with the National Democratic Institute. From 2005 to 2011, she served as program director for NDI in South Sudan, which supported the implementation of the peace agreement. She also worked with the Forum of Federations on Comparative Federalism and with the research unit of the Western Cape Provincial Parliament in South Africa. Welcome, Susan. Our next speaker will be Mater Tela, who is a community member and organizer with the Tigray community of Louisville. She is a data scientist and a recent graduate with a double master's degree in public health, biostatistics, and business data analytics. She's one of the thousands of forces behind the Tigray movement advocating for an end to the war and genocide on Tigray and bringing awareness to the genocide, humanitarian crisis, and sexual violence that is happening in Tigray in Ethiopia today. Welcome, Mother. Our next speaker will be Aman Ahmed, who is the president of the Oromo community of Kentucky and are part of the executive committee Global Oromo Community. Aman was born in 1980 in a place called Arsi Bokoji in Ethiopia. He graduated from Rift Valley University in sociology and anthropology in 2011. He has been president of the Oromo community of Kentucky for 5 years and helped establish the Global Oromo Community Association in 2020. He is a father of 3 daughters and 2 sons. Welcome, Aman. And our last speaker today will be Yodit Dori, who is an Ethiopian community member here in Louisville and a graduate of our Louisville Welcome Academy. Yodit was born in Ethiopia and lived there until she was 14. She came to the United States as an exchange student attending St. Francis High School in Louisville, Kentucky. She later graduated from the University of Louisville. In her career, she interpreted for the court system in Kentucky and in surrounding areas. She worked to bridge the language barrier for growing immigrant communities and has volunteered to help the Ethiopian and Amharic-speaking Somalians. She assists the Louisville area immigrant population with the immigration process, getting a driver's license, and processing government assistance programs. Her passion is helping single immigrant women and children to adjust to a new country. Welcome, Yodit. So we will start our program with Susan, who will help us to kind of get the background and the history of how we got to the current situation in Ethiopia. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan to help us to understand the broader area of Ethiopia and how we got to.
Happy to be back in Kentucky, even if virtually, having partnered with the World Affairs Council back in December for an event on protecting religious minorities. As the mayor said better than I can, USIP is this country's national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by the US Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for US and global security. In areas around the world experiencing conflict, the Institute works with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. So I've asked to show a map for a moment of the country that we'll be talking about today. 2 years ago, Ethiopia was in the international news. Prime Minister Abiy had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership in what was what was and is a historic transition, and particularly for opening peace with Eritrea. That peace ended a frozen war of almost 20 years. The political transition opened space for political opposition to return to the country, resulted in over 10,000 political prisoners being released, and made a promise of a vision of unity, of forgiveness, of economic reforms, and I think a future that many Ethiopians have dreamed and hoped for a long time. This last year, Ethiopia has been back in the news primarily for other reasons. As has already been talked about this morning, the violence and continued violent conflict in Tigray continues to be in the headlines. So Tigray, the northeast region, which borders with Eritrea, is the region from where the former head of the governing coalition that led Ethiopia for a number of decades comes from. And the conflict erupted at a point when some of the really critical questions related to the transition came to a head. I think what is most important to know right now is that crisis has resulted in a flow of refugees, Ethiopian refugees, into neighboring Sudan, a country that itself is experiencing a very fragile transition. There have been and continue to be distressing reports of human rights violations, sexual and gender-based violence, and acts by all conflict groups that are involved that come from both Ethiopian and international organizations. And as a result of the ongoing fighting and the fighting that took place over the last several months, the UN is estimating that 5.2 million people are at risk of famine. So we're looking at what is really a crisis that is political, that is economic, and above all has tremendous humanitarian consequences. If this weren't complicated enough, elections are planned to take place on June 21st. These are the first national elections as part of the political transition that started in 2018. At the same time, regionally, there is an ongoing dispute between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the use of the dam and water flow, as well as some of the safety provisions that are in place. In addition, along the border between Ethiopia and Sudan, there is a dispute over where the boundary lies and which communities have access to use which land. So we see a region that I think is impacted directly at the most human level by conflict and violence, up to the regional and trans-regional dynamics. So what I wanted to do today, with humility, given that there are people on the panel who know Ethiopia much more deeply than I do, but share with you maybe a few things that I think is helpful for everybody to know about the country, about what's happening, and lastly, why does Ethiopia matter? So I just returned from Ethiopia. I had the privilege of being there for 2 weeks and have spent time going back and forth over the last several years. So I have, I think, 6 things that people need to know about this country. One, Ethiopia is a federal country, not unlike the United States, but the federal states are established and organized on an ethno-federal basis. So this was part of the logic of governance in the past. And the question of how the country will be governed going forward, what will the constitutional structure will be, is a key question that will need to be answered as part of the transition. The second thing to know, Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa. It is home to between 100 and 120 million people. 41% of the population is under the age of 15. And it is among the countries in Africa where we see the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. And we know from public opinion research that young Africans aspire to have meaningful employment and to have a political voice. And I think that this has been a key driver to many of the transitions that we're seeing in the Horn. Third, Ethiopia is a country of tremendous both ethnic and religious diversity. It is home to Orthodox Christians, to Muslims, to Pentecostals, and has a really rich diversity in terms of the ethnic composition. Fourth, Ethiopia is a key leader in the region, in the Horn of Africa and in Africa as a whole. Addis Ababa, the capital, is the seat of the African Union, which is the intergovernmental body on peace and security and integration for the continent. Ethiopia was a founding member and remains a critical part of that. Ethiopia is also an anchor in what you see in the map and what we talk about as the Red Sea. And that tiny little point where the Red Sea comes together is where $700 billion of trade for the world passes every day. If you tracked over the last year, we learned the consequences and the importance of that when it was blocked by one of the freighters that was trying to pass through. But Ethiopia has played a role in peace and security in the Horn more broadly, and is really a critical U.S. partner. Fifth, I'm always struck by the depth of deep national pride. Ethiopia has never been colonized. It is a country with a deep history. It is referenced in the Bible in several places. It has a history at a point where it was led by an emperor, and it has gone through many different transitions and experienced periods of really horrific violence, of repression and suffering. So the violence that the country is experiencing today is not entirely new, And I think for many people, it touches very deeply on past histories. And then my last point is a lighter point, but Ethiopia has the very best coffee. And if you want to enjoy your coffee in Ethiopia properly, you need to have it with popcorn. And I would highly recommend that. So let me move to what is happening in the country. And I wanted to just touch on 4 broad trends. One, as I mentioned earlier, is this political transition that was initiated in 2018. Many analysts have talked about this as comparable to what happened in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, where some of the fundamental structures and assumptions of governance and the way that countries are governed are being questioned in the Horn of Africa. We saw this in the uprising and revolution in Sudan. We saw a different type of transition in Ethiopia, but where the former governing coalition selected Prime Minister Abiy and agreed to and initiated a series of major reforms. And let me just say on this, transitions are always challenging. They're never one directional. It's not always progress in one way forward. They're always conflictual, almost by their definition. The key question is whether those conflicts can be managed without the use of violence. And I think if I had to boil it down to the questions that Ethiopia is grappling with in the transition is 1, how to live together in the future, how to govern the country, what is the relationship between leaders and people broadly, and 2, how to address the past, how to acknowledge and deal with corruption, human rights abuses, violence, and exclusion that took place under past governments. So the second major development that I wanted to touch on is the topic for today, which is the crisis in Tigray. As has been said, the fighting started in November. Most people who are joining here today from the United States were probably busy voting in the US elections as this crisis was really unfolding. How the fighting itself started remains somewhat contested. But what I think is most important in this is that it is clear that the logic had developed that violence was the only possibility, both for the government of Ethiopia, who have reported that the senior leadership of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front attacked the military Northern Command that was based in Tigray. And so therefore initiated what was called a rule of law operation to address what was fundamentally seen as a threat to the state. On the other hand, the TPLF has talked about the squeeze that they were feeling and the threat that violence was imminent, either from the federal government or from across the border in Eritrea. Now, this is complicated, not just because of the human and humanitarian costs that are common in all types of conflicts, but also because as the Ethiopian National Defense Forces were retreating and moving out following the first violence, they crossed the border into Eritrea. And Eritrean troops have been deployed as part of the operation and as part of holding territory in the ongoing conflict. So this adds a layer of international considerations into the conflict and the violence, and a layer of complexity in terms of a very long, conflictual and painful relationship between the government of Eritrea and past governments of Ethiopia. I think what I'd like to highlight here is that it's clear that the cost of violence is really intolerably high. As I said earlier, the humanitarian crisis is severe. There are credible reports of human rights violations, sexual and gender-based violence, and continued challenges despite funding and efforts that are taking place to get humanitarian assistance to those people who are being most impacted by the conflict itself. The third trend that I wanted to touch on briefly is that if we just focused on Tigray, I think we're missing the bigger picture and obscuring some of the other dynamics in the country. Tigray isn't the only place that has experienced violence and politically related violence over the last months and since the transition took place. There are prominent political opposition leaders who are in jail. There are several opposition parties who have boycotted the upcoming elections. And I think as we look at the broader trends and the possibilities of a way forward for Ethiopia and how the vision that's been articulated for the transition, and I think that most people hope and aspire will come to fruition, it's a bigger question than just Tigray. And then the last piece I wanted to touch on was efforts for peace. The situation is serious and concerning, and I think merits attention and action. And there is a lot of attention and action that's taking place within Ethiopia itself. I was really touched by the efforts that are underway, led by civic groups, to go and listen to young people, to listen to women, to listen to people who are drinking tea and coffee, and understand what are their priorities, to understand how committed they are to peace and what would tip them towards violence and what could keep them out of violence. I was really struck by what I see as courageous efforts of exploring what inclusive political dialogue could look like, to have the very hard conversations about what does the future look like for Ethiopia? How do Ethiopians live together in the future? And what does that mean about how the country has to grapple with its own past? I think sometimes when there are cases of really horrible conflict and violence, we rightly get focused on that. And I wanted to take a moment to recognize that there are leaders and people who are working very hard to keep open space and to open further the spaces for peace. So let me just finish by talking a little bit about why Ethiopia matters, because I think that's important for us to bear in mind and contextualize at a moment when we're in a very turbulent moment for the world overall. For our Ethiopian colleagues, this isn't a question that even needs to be contemplated. And I think those of us who live in the US have a much more sober understanding of how violence and structures of violence will impact on individuals and families and communities in a country. But for USIP, Ethiopia matters because we focus on places that are at risk of conflict and try to support those who are working towards peace and learn from their efforts. We also work with places where there already is violence to help those who are trying to find a way out of it. And then when violence ends, how can countries recover and work together? For the United States more broadly, which I don't speak for the US government, but what we've seen in some of our analysis and our work is that the US and Ethiopia have a historical partnership that's based on shared goals and values. That doesn't mean that both the US and Ethiopia always live up to those aspirations of goals and values, but there is a common and shared approach there. Our work has also pointed to Ethiopia as really a critical part of a political and security space in the Horn of Africa and the broader Red Sea that bridges out into the Gulf, that should be at the center of US national security interests. There is a deep possibility of future and growing economic partnerships. And for the United States government, the strong Ethiopian community, the strong voting Ethiopian community, the strong Ethiopian American community who are citizens, it's recognized that they are activated and paying attention to what's happening at home and are touched deeply by the violence and conflict that's taking place. So let me end there with thanks again to the World Affairs Council for this dialogue. I appreciate that the experiences and the perspectives of people who I talk to in Ethiopia are diverging and in many ways are deeply polarized. And so I'm grateful for this space and for the courage and the generosity of those who are joining us to find and make the time to listen and hopefully find areas of commonality to really support what is the vision and the Ethiopia that Ethiopians really deserve. Thanks, Amos. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for helping us to kind of get that broader perspective of what is happening. And I think that last point where, you discuss about, why Ethiopia matters, it's very important for this discussion and for us here in the United States. And I kind of want to ask a little bit if you can share sort of the historical relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because I think it's important for us to understand that as we speak of Ethiopia as a sort of broker for peace in the Horn of Africa, and maybe touch on what are the implications for that entire region, including Somalia and Sudan, if we do not reach a place where there's coexistence in Ethiopia.
Thanks. It's a great question. Ethiopia and Eritrea have a long history. I think if we thought about it as a marriage, there was a point where it was one single country, a married country, and I think probably most people focus their attention on the division that took place between Ethiopia and Eritrea and the subsequent war. Particularly over the border areas and the border demarcation. For about the past 20 years, that's been disputed and frozen. And in many ways, much of Eritrean government policy has been predicated around the threat of Ethiopia along its borders and the risk that Ethiopia would not respect the outcomes of what the UN had decided and determined in terms of the borders, and the risk that what was a frozen war could turn to a hot war again. I think the relationship has developed and evolved in some important ways. Of course, in Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy is a new leader in this relationship. In Eritrea, President Isaias has been in power throughout that long part of the history and the better parts and the very difficult parts of that marriage and divorce and realigning of the relationship. In many ways, I think the former ruling coalition led by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, President Isaias has a very bad relationship with them. I think in many ways Eritrea blames them. Many in Ethiopia blame that group for the conflict that took place between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and for the corruption and human rights abuses and the closed space that Ethiopia experienced in that time period. So how does this relate to the broader region? One of the amazing things about working in the Horn of Africa is that for the last decade, it's been one of the places where multilateralism really works, where the regional body, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, was the constraint on the exercise of violence. That body convened mediation efforts between Sudan and South Sudan during South Sudan's separation. Within South Sudan, during the most recent iteration of that civil war, the IGAD has been active in Somalia in supporting that state and nation building process and in trying to counter the threat of Al-Shabaab. And Ethiopia has been a really active partner there. And what we see now is that with these changes in the region, that the Intergovernmental Authority on Development is really having a hard time responding. With Ethiopia being sort of in the center of some of these fundamental questions about boundaries, are boundaries being respected within the country and with its neighbors, with fundamental questions about what constitutes a sovereign question that is only for the country to deal with, and when is it necessary and needed for the region, for the African Union, for the UN to engage on a matter of peace and security. And I think this is something that's very much at stake in the conversations right now. And people who I talk to are concerned that there's eyes are on Ethiopia and how the leadership handles this internal crisis, because it will signal what's permissible and what's acceptable, what are the norms and values for the rest of the region more broadly.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Again, I think like all eyes being on Ethiopia is going to really affect, how that entire region moves on forward. I just want to remind the participants that you can continue to add questions and comments in the chat. But we are going to move on to hearing from our community leaders to sort of get a sense of how the diaspora, Ethiopian diaspora here in the US is directly affected by what's happening in Ethiopia. And so I'm turning it to Matter to share with us her personal experience and where she's coming from in this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate you all. I wanted to start off by saying Ms. Susan Stigant mentioned that Ethiopia has never been colonized. I think this narrative, as she said, mentioned that Ethiopia had a marriage with what is now Eritrea, was once split and invaded by the Italians. So that's a little bit of background history that some people can go into, but I think we can focus on mentioning that the war didn't start when Ethiopia didn't start with the northern region of Tigray. By the way, it's pronounced Tigray, not Tigray, attacking the Northern Command. This is a narrative that has been fabricated by the Ethiopian government to justify the killings and the mass punishment of the Tigray people. So I really wanted to stress that, as well as really wanting the audience to understand and question how has the unelected Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed Ali, who was also a Nobel Peace Prize winner, leading a full-fledged war on the innocent civilians of Tigray, and has invited a neighboring country, Eritrea, who has sought revenge for so long, to come into Ethiopia in the northernmost region known as Tigray, and cause so much destruction. And I want to point out that today marks 206 days of Tigray genocide. That is 7 months of fear, hunger, gang rape, death, massacres, and humanitarian aid being blocked into Tigray. And this hits home for me because that's where my family is. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, whom I have not been able to reach. Many we have not been able to reach. I've recently learned that my uncle, who is a peaceful farmer, has died in the hands of Eritrean troops. I would like for the audience to ask themselves, why are Eritreans in Ethiopia? Why hasn't the unelected Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed Ali, forced the Eritrean troops out of Tigray? For 206 days, families within the Tigray diaspora here in Louisville and around the world have been worried sick for their families, as majority of us do not know where our families are, as many millions have been displaced. 2.2 million people have displaced is an estimate number that has been given. We don't know whether they're alive or dead. I would like to also mention that we have Louisville residents here that have fled the Tigray war recently and are completely traumatized. We have a little boy as young as 8 months old who was born 45 days prior to the war starting on November 4th of 2020. And his mother has mentioned to me that his mother, who's my cousin, has mentioned to me how difficult it was for her to breastfeed her child, who was 45 days old at the time of this war breaking out. And when this war broke out, I want everybody to know that when these Eritrean troops, they weren't solely doing these committing crimes and atrocities and war crimes on their own. Ethiopian government, as well as Amhara militia, the Ethiopian troops, as well as Amhara militia, collectively came together while Abiy Ahmed Ali and Isaias Afwerki, the dictator of Eritrea, collectively came together and pressed in a genocidal operation against the innocent civilians of Tigray. I want you to ask yourself, why are 6 million people, which makes up the population in Tigray, a target? As the unelected Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed Ali, has said, this is an operation, an attack of the Tigray leaders. I want you all to ask that. Why are there 52,000 women coming out, an estimate of 52,000 women estimated to have been raped? It's been confirmed over 10,500 women have been raped by Eritrean troops. CNN has come out with a report where a surgeon was removing foreign objects out of a woman's vagina, which included used condoms, nails, plastic. These are just a few of things that the people of Tigray are suffering. I wanted to also mention that one of my nephews, he, after returning from Ethiopia and fleeing, he quotes, I wanted to quote him, that there were jet attacks every day and they were hiding in the basement and we were worried and we weren't sure if we were going to make it. He's 12 years old. Children should not have war stories like this. A child who's 2 years old going through the mall, who had returned from Tigray, is walking through the mall and she hears a loud air conditioning and she's fearing that this is an airplane, a jet that is about to attack. I want you guys to think about this. These are children. These are Louisville residents. And these are experiences that many children, mothers, fathers, and everyday Tigrayan citizens are experiencing every single day for 206 days and counting. This war has been in the dark. As soon as on November 4th, the Ethiopian government completely put Tigray in a telecommunication and electricity blackout. Banks were closed. We were not able to send any money to our family. We were not able to reach our families. We didn't even know how they were. And that during that time, there were drones that were being sent into Tigray and striking homes, churches, mosques, killing hundreds and thousands of people. And these drones were coming from UAE's military base in Eritrea. As something as recent as this past Monday, one of our Louisville residents found out that her brother was one of 500 men and women that were rounded up and taken from a city in Tigray and rounded up and taken to the border of Eritrea. They were then released and returned and released back to where they were. And when we found out that, her brother was okay, but we found out that a lot of the children were victims. Children are victims of this war. Children are victims of rape. I also want to stress that we're one step away from a famine. This is something that United Nations Security Council, Mark, had stressed. There are 6 million people in Tigray and 5.2 million people are starving and in need of emergency food. It is essential that we get this food and aid to them. And as there are airstrikes, and violent attacks among innocent civilians in Tigray, I want to stress that children are losing limbs. They're getting them cut off. If you're refused rape from an Eritrean troop or Ethiopian troop, you're likely to lose a limb. There's a girl, 18 years old. Her name is Mona Lisa. She refused rape from an Eritrean soldier and she lost her limbs and now is in the hospital and receiving treatment, as well as going through severe psychological trauma from her experience. These are just a few stories that have touched myself as well as many other Tigrayans as we continue to worry every single day for the being of people in Tigray, the lives of people in Tigray. So I wanted to also just stress that food is being weaponized, rape is being weaponized in Tigray, and it's essential that we get the essential needs to Tigray. Humanitarian aid needs to be open. Unfortunately, the Ethiopian government is blocking this and obstructing any type of shipment coming into Tigray. And we stress that this needs to be open, or else 6 million people will die due to famine and hunger and rape, along with a lot of other atrocities. Thank you.
This is certainly disheartening to hear of the realities that many in Ethiopia are facing at the moment, and specifically how it's affecting our Louisville residents and American citizens. And Yodit, do you want to share your personal experience?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. First of all, this is really great. This is what Louisville is all about, bringing all the international groups and focusing and making sure we're not just lost into the system, we're highlighted. And Mayor Fisher, I'm very thankful and grateful for what he's been doing with the immigrant community in the Louisville area. And so because of that, we're having this conversation today, and thank you for all of you. I'm not going to be getting into too much into the politics part of it. And the question is, how's this affecting me, and how's the community here on Louisville? And I think Mahadir has spoken and made it clear, and it really is it saddens me to hear what is happening in our country. And it's not just in Tigray, it's in all parts of Ethiopia, and just in every ethnic group, as you know, is having its whether it's this has been an ongoing situation in our country. And so how is this affecting me personally? Even though I came here in the late 80s, I have family members all throughout Ethiopia. And so when something is going on in Ethiopia, it affects me because I have families, friends, relatives all across. And people maybe, their children brought together, went to school, and been to birthdays and weddings and things. So they became one people, been one people for so long. And now to see what the political part of it is doing to our people, I'm going to speak our people, to Ethiopia as a whole, it's very saddening right now because nobody's winning. No one is a winner here. Everybody's a loser. Everybody's losing because death is occurring left and right. Hunger and everything is going on. That's affecting me personally because I do have family members everywhere. And here locally, we went to church together. We celebrated birthdays. We celebrated weddings. We celebrated graduation. And all of that now, it's just came to a point where we're not even speaking to one another. People are not approaching one another. People are not helping one another. People are not going to someone when they're sick, even though it's not because of just the corona issue. This is all because of what's going on back home. People are not coming to your rescue anymore unless you are a certain group. This is a and people who used to freely come to anyone for some help, and now they tend to target, to go to a different direction. It's not because that individual person has done any wrong to them. It's just because of what's happening back home. And it's saddening to me and to almost everyone here locally in Louisville. So this is what I have to say as far as how it's affecting me here and how it's affecting my family members back home. Thank you.
Thank you, Yodit, for sharing. Aman?
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all. As Mr. Amos mentioned, Oromo community. The Oromo community, a little bit about the Oromo community is the largest community in the Ethiopia, over 15 to 55 million population. Oromo community, as everybody knows, so many times, and internationally or in Ethiopia, we have been showing so many protests because of Oromo community, regardless of age. The current government is jailing, killing. So many chaos going in Oromia as well as Tigray. In Tigray, in fact, that is a conventional war, that is big war. But in Oromia, every day, every night, the people killed by armed government militaries or troops, and also over 10,000 women, young women, men, elders, political leaders, religious leaders, everybody in jail. Currently, the political prominent Johar Mohammed peacefully he tried peacefully transfer the current Ethiopian political situation, but he's in jail with his colleagues without any problem, being he's struggling to make peace in the country. Today, if you go to Ethiopia or in Oromia, without reason, being Oromo, the people got killed. They give name as Shani. Shani means that Oromo people, Oromo Liberation Front. That is even not sustained as they say as the army, but everybody have the tapela and the name. Because of that, everybody got jailed and the killing. So we are today really concerning the peace of the country. If Ethiopia, there is no Ethiopia, there is no peace in Ethiopia, there is no peace in the Horn of Africa. That country today is big problem. Nobody have any warranty or guarantee to come out and come back. The citizens are terrorized. There is no freedom of speech. No citizen can say anything about current situation in Ethiopia. Everybody can see, even in the United States, in Australia, Europe, and millions of Oromo communities every single day doing protests because of this problem. We really affected. Being we have a family back home. Every single night, every single day, we waiting something here bad news from back home. Even not ours, even our children's, they worried about their family back home. Generally, I don't know the international community how is focusing on Ethiopia. The Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, after he get position on Prime Minister along the last 3 years, the only peace in Ethiopia for 6 months. After 6 months, the thing is going to change it. The country totally change it to the war place, worse country. As much as we can, even there is no way to communicate with the government. They block everything. They control everything. There is no way to deal with them. Being political prisoners, political leaders in a prisoner. There is no opposition leaders. Anybody can deal with government. Everybody in jail, especially the leaders. If you are any political supporter, without no question, everybody has to go jail. 100% there is no any democratic in Ethiopia. It is lots. The pregnant women without last 3 years, thousands of Oromo community was died by armies, an armed community. If you show a little bit protest, the peaceful protest, everybody go jail, everybody got killed. So many things going around Ethiopia. We're really worried about that country. How Ethiopian citizens can live together. There is a highly division between the citizens. That is just the government maybe is considered as the citizens as divided, maybe get a benefit from that division. So many things going around there. So I can't say more than this. There's a lot of things. I'm not a politician, actually. I'm just a community leader. There is so many Oromo scholars, politicians, they can say more than. So this is all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman, for sharing your perspective and your experience as well. And I think I would really like to echo Mayor Fisher's words earlier that, having these conversations help us to humanize things that we typically hear on the news that we don't feel as close or the proximity that it may be to us. And we are living amongst people who are affected by what's happening all over the world. So we're going to turn to questions now. We have some questions that were submitted prior to the conversation and some that have been sent in the chat and on Facebook. One of the first questions was, is anybody in Kentucky providing any humanitarian aid in Ethiopia?
Can I say something, Amos?
Yes, sure.
Yes, I can answer that question a little bit. With the help of a nonprofit organization here in Louisville, Kentucky, known as SOS International, we were able to send a 40-foot container on May 11th, so a couple of weeks ago, which is headed to Tigray. Not only are there thousands of medical supplies as well as hospital beds and other medical equipment, but we also included other life-saving aid resources that were collected from other NGOs here in the Louisville area. And there are numerous, that includes numerous bleach makers from an organization known as Water Step, as well as 1,000 forfeited meals from another organization known as Love the Hungry, and warm blankets from Queen's Daughters. That's also here in Louisville, in the Louisville area. So I wanted to just use this opportunity to encourage the people here in the Louisville area, as well as citizens in the United States and citizens of the world, to take action and donate to the people of Tigray as we need it, as well as amplifying their voices. I wanted to give a shout out to SOS International, as well as Love the Hungry, Water Step, and Queen's Daughters. And hopefully more nonprofit organizations and other organizations and entities will take part in this and helping aid Tigray.
Somebody asked about the World Food Program, and I want to turn the question to Susan to ask what has been the experience of humanitarian organizations and other organizations like USIP in responding to what's happening in Ethiopia.
Yeah, I think the World Food Program and the government of Ethiopia entered into an agreement for delivery of humanitarian assistance. The Ethiopian government also has talked very publicly about their financial commitment and efforts towards reconstruction in Tigray. I think one of the major concerns is that that's not getting to the people who need it. It might be getting to the capital city, but there are consistent reports and concerns from UN agencies and humanitarian organizations that their ability to access the region broadly is very limited. This is always, in many ways, it should be a simple conversation, right? This is about people's lives being saved and taking care of basic needs. In other ways, it's often a quite complex conversation. There are often concerns about security, where there are ongoing hostilities, and the need to negotiate humanitarian access in Tigray. That's very complicated at the moment because it's not just negotiating with the government. It's negotiating with the Eritrean Defense Forces. It's negotiating with the Amhara armed groups that are there. It's negotiating with the Tigrayan Defense Forces as well. And so figuring out in each location who needs to be negotiated with, it takes time and effort. That's not to say that's any sort of excuse for humanitarian assistance not getting to the people who absolutely need it and deserve it. So I just underline that this is another example of where there are very polarized narratives about what is taking place. And I think the focus of this conversation on what is needed, I think is really the right place to put that focus and how to get the help to the people who are being most impacted by the violence.
Yes, indeed. And I think there's a question here that kind of alludes to what you just said there. And Denise Sears asks, what can we do as fellow residents in Louisville to provide support to our neighbors from Ethiopia? And what can the U.S. government do to help bring peace? Maybe, Susan, you want to go ahead and start, and then the others could chime in.
Sure. Well, let me start at the U.S. government level. I think we've seen that the U.S. government has taken a much more active voice and a stronger stance over the last several weeks. President Biden has appointed a special envoy for the Horn of Africa, who works directly with Secretary of State Blinken. And his task is, number one, in addressing and ensuring humanitarian access and moving towards a ceasefire in Tigray. He's also been tasked to look at the issues related to the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the dispute between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and the border issues. The U.S. government has announced visa sanctions against any entity who is blocking humanitarian access, who is blocking progress towards a ceasefire. And I think from a peace building perspective, all of that also has to be matched with opening channels of dialogue and figuring out what is the best way to try to find some sort of access and solution going forward. On a more community level, I'll just say that what I heard from panelists today about the difficulty and the tensions between individuals, I also heard when I was in Ethiopia. I heard people really deeply saddened that within their families, that there were topics that couldn't be discussed. That some families who are mixed and come from different parts of the country have always called themselves Ethiopian. And they've now been asked to call themselves by their ethnic nationality instead. And I heard people really deeply dismayed and pained that there were people suffering in the country, and that they didn't see the acknowledgement and the honesty and the leadership that they expected to see in the country. And that's political leadership, but it's leadership across the board. There's civic and religious leadership from religious leaders. And so I think the conversation that's happening here, the type of solidarity, is a really important example. And if that can be achieved amongst Ethiopians in the United States, I really believe it will have a ripple effect. It will provide an umbrella under which it becomes safer for people inside of the country to think as Ethiopians. And I think that's absolutely critical for the future of the country.
Yodit, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yes, actually, like what Susan has said, pretty much he covered most of what I thought about. But government involvement now, there are some things that I agree with and some I don't agree. The people of Ethiopia has been fighting and been in war for a very long time. Now they just focus on certain groups and how the damage has been done on certain groups. And there's killing in almost every ethnic group that's going on. All the horrible things that is throughout Ethiopia. The humanitarians need almost every part of Ethiopia. And yes, there are certain areas that need groups that will
I think we lost Yodit. We'll let her come back and get back to what she was saying. Meyer, do you want to add anything?
In terms of humanitarian and aiding Tigray?
What can the population of Louisville do to support, and what can the U.S. government do?
Yeah, so I would encourage our Louisville residents here to help support and elevate what SOS International is doing, as well as reaching out to our congressmen and representatives in Washington, D.C., and pressuring them. And this goes out to all of our U.S. citizens to pressure as in opening the gates to allow aid into Tigray. This is the essential thing. This is the hard part, and this is the obstacle that we're facing, is not being able to get the resource to Tigray. We need these roads open. We need unhindered access. So this is what I encourage our community here, is to reach out to our representatives and our congressmen and stress that, as well as continue to amplify the voices of Tigray and donating. It is really important that we secure and restore the human rights to the people of Tigray, as they have been violated for the past 7 months. And we hope that this will end soon, and that we can talk to our loved ones with hopes that they are alive and that they are well. Thank you.
Thank you. Aman?
Thank you. What I would suggest the national community, the most important and the fundamental in order to support the Ethiopian citizen as much as possible. First of all, we need to have peace in the country. That's the most important. At this time, even any aid can maybe sent to Ethiopia. I don't think so. It can be reached there because of every place is closed. The government has to sit down, has to open national dialogue with the all political prisoners and all political leaders in the country. That's the most important. What is our fear? If Ethiopia continue within this current situation, maybe it's coming 2 months, 3 months, the total is a country fragile. That's a big issue right now. And the national community has to focus on and has to take fast action to stop the government killing people, jailing people, and has to bring national consensus with political leaders. That's the most important. again, as we know, every Ethiopian part of Ethiopian, especially in the western Oromian region, there is big war right now right there. The people need help. There is no internet, there is no electricity. I mean, I remember last 3 weeks ago, one young man, he is religious, he is Orthodox religious, he's a singer. The Ethiopian armies catch him and they brought to in front of the collect peoples in front of the shot him, regardless of any mercy, without any problem. So, dying the people every day, this is experiencing right now, regardless of any age. So, the national community has to focus on bring between citizens and the political leaders national dialogue. That's the first thing with what I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, the next question is for you from Nabiyu. She says, or he says, you raised an important point that humanitarian access is constrained because access has to be negotiated with multiple actors. The Ethiopian government is trying to keep the international community away from Tigray on the basis of sovereignty principles. While it is apparent that the Ethiopian administration has no effective control over Tigray, don't you think the US has to override any sovereignty card invoked by the Ethiopian government?
Yeah, I'm not a specialist on humanitarian delivery or humanitarian access. I do know that there's an important conversation taking place about what's called red lines in humanitarian access delivery, and that's really thinking about what are the core principles that the international community, that the UN, and those who are providing humanitarian assistance can set. Often when it gets into a conversation of sovereignty or not sovereignty, it becomes quite positional very quickly. And so in the instance of negotiating humanitarian access, I think in other countries and instances, figuring out what are the parameters, standing firm on those, which requires not just the United States, quite honestly, but it also requires the UN and other international systems. It requires not just the UN agencies that are doing the delivery, but also the more political side. So the role of the members of the Security Council that stand behind the humanitarian organizations who are doing this incredibly hard and quite dangerous work of negotiating at every step. And so I think that's where there is a lot of attention right now, and I think continued attention needs to be paid there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to keep you here for a little bit longer because the next question I think is also for you. Do you know what the general sentiment on the rule of law operation is in Tigray? And from the local population in Addis Ababa, is Abiy still popular in the country?
Yeah, I think this is it's quite difficult to assess, to be honest, and I can share what I've heard somewhat anecdotally. I've heard that there is a growing sentiment among Tigrayans that it's hard to imagine how an Ethiopian government could be credible and how they could feel safe and protected and taken care of by a future Ethiopian government. And I think this is driving concerns that the longer that the conflict continues, the longer that there's silence about what's taking place, the more that it drives political support for very early sort of ideas around what does autonomy look like, or can Tigray even be a part of Ethiopia going forward? And I think this provokes a real concern about the fragmentation of the country overall. Some people will say that that's grossly exaggerated, But I think there are currents, and there are people who are talking about this and who are concerned about that dynamic. I think amongst Ethiopians more broadly, there are many people who experienced pain and suffering under the former governing coalition that the TPLF led, and many people remain very feel like that was never addressed or acknowledged, and so in some ways the transition happened without really dealing with the past or coming to grips with it. And I've heard some people say that allows some people to close their eyes more easily to what's taking place, because they can see that there were individuals who hold some responsibility. I don't think I heard anybody say that justifies suffering of a civilian population, or to say that they believe that violence is the way out. But I think the complication and the pain of the past that has been left unresolved has made it harder to develop a movement, a coalition, a sense of urgency amongst Ethiopians broadly to address the ongoing crises in the country.
Yes, definitely. I think addressing some of those wounds that are still affecting what's happening now and where the country will go forward is going to be critical. I think we only have time for one more question, and I think I'm going to tie it up with this question that says that despite the collective heartbreak, suffering, and sense of betrayal, are there any efforts to reach other communities in Ethiopia, including the Amhara elite? The person says, I'm saying this because without critical mass within Ethiopia for solidarity, the different conflict systems, especially the ongoing war in Tigray, won't come to an end. There should be pressure from different sides to put pressure on the government. And I think I'm going to close that up again with Susan. You talked a lot about healing from your opening remarks, and just now in terms of the past and what is happening currently. And so I would ask, what does coexistence look like in Ethiopia if we were to imagine a future beyond or after what's happening now?
Gosh, I think that's the $1 million question in many ways. And I think I'm the least qualified to actually answer that question on this panel. What I can say is that in other transitions that have succeeded or that have stayed as nonviolent as possible, there needs to be a really robust national conversation about what does coexistence look like? What does it take to get there? Something that works in one country does not work necessarily in another country. But we do know that opening space for people to say what is in their minds and in their hearts, and to identify what are the resiliences within the country itself. What mechanisms exist for healing at a community level? What are the connection points that the country has, and how can those be built upon? What are the pains and the wrongs of the past? And I don't name those because some of that is from people's own lived experiences, right? What are those, and which ones need to be dealt with, and how? And so I think this is not something that has a straightforward answer, unfortunately. But I will say, like, opening that space for genuine dialogue, opening space where people feel free and able to speak their minds, creating the type of sense of compassion for everyone in a way that sounds like Louisville's been really quite successful in doing. Those are, I think, the ingredients that can help to get to those answers. And there are people in neighboring countries to Ethiopia and the continent, and to Colombia to other parts of the world, where people who have walked this similar path, I think, are ready and stand ready to share their experiences and to stand in solidarity. And my hope for Ethiopia and Ethiopians is that they'll have an opportunity to draw on that and then to forge their path forward.
Matter, do you want to respond to that question?
I think that it's gonna take a lot of dialogue and for us to really understand one another, really hear one another's sufferings, and to not dismiss what we're saying to one another. I wanted to ask Ms. Stagnant a question. As what would it take to get Eritrean troops out of Tigray in order for Tigrayans to be safe within Ethiopia, and for the international action if they don't leave Tigray?
Because I think everybody is searching for approaches and solutions. And I think if it were straightforward, then it would have happened already. And I think that we need the collective thinking as well as avoiding making this just an intellectual exercise. It's very easy for this to become a question of international law and something that is highly technical. And the human aspect of it can't be lost in my mind. And so I'd welcome a continued conversation and sharing ideas and the spaces that we have to try to inform and provide ideas to how the U.S. government is having this. I'd welcome carrying forward your insights into that.
Thank you.
And possibly that's a conversation that can be had, following this and also of the current stream. I know we're running out of time, but I want to give Aman some time, maybe a minute, to share what he thinks coexistence looks like for Ethiopia.
Can you repeat it again?
What do you think coexistence looks like in Ethiopia?
Well, as I said, everything aside, there is no better place in Ethiopia. All corner Ethiopia have a problem right now. So, as I say, the best solution in a national community has to focus on it. It is because in Ethiopia, Ethiopian citizens, children is suffering too much. Women's, elders, political leaders, as well, all citizens. We cannot say, especially in Tigray and Oromo, is very sad. In Tigray, as we say, the conventional war is undergoing. As well, in Oromo, even the Eritrean troops is even right now in Oromo. You know, the way they use it, they change the military, the Ethiopian military uniform. Even once it comes to the rural area, even there is no mercy. If they see on the road, they keep shot. Citizens are terrorized. Ethiopia really needs the national community focus, because as I tried to mention earlier, if there is no peace in Ethiopia, it's probably bad for the Horn of Africa. We can't secure peace in Ethiopia, in Horn of Africa, unless Ethiopia get peace. Because the big problem is last 25 years with the TPL was federalism is okay, but still some problem is some leaders have their own problem toward the citizen. At this time, the thing is gone worse. I remember over 5,000 men and the women's peaceful protester was killed. A little bit, we got some transition where Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to the position for 6 months. The country looks like great, everything good. Citizens have a hope. The citizens are focused to go struggling with poverty. Right now, even the life is very hard. The poverty is highly increased. The life standard is, I can't mention. The people even dying from the hunger right now. Not only war. So as a result of bad government, this whole situation happened. The best solution for Ethiopian citizens, if we can negotiate with government to bring a peaceful in the country, that's work. Unless this regime has, this government has to be changing. That's the best solution for the country. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman, and thank you, Mater, and thank you, Yodit, if you are still watching us, for sharing your realities that we don't always hear about when we hear about international news or what is happening in other parts of the world. And thank you, Susan, for sharing with us your expertise and experience in the Horn of Africa in general. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn it back to Cheyenne now to close this out for us.
Yes, thank you all for Amos for moderating and all of our speakers today. Just echoing what Amos was saying, we realize how personal this is all for you, and we just want to thank you for sharing your experience and putting a spotlight on this humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia. It is heartbreaking what is happening, and I think we all want to be able to, do something. And if it starts with this dialogue, that's a place to start. And also, our panelists have put some resources and information in the chat in terms of the local efforts and organizations. So anybody out there listening, and please, those are good places to start if you want to support the humanitarian side of this. There are still a lot of questions that remain. Clearly, it is an ongoing crisis. But we hope that through today's conversation, you have all gained a little better sense of what's occurring in the region. What we're going to do, we're going to have a recording of this program available on our YouTube channel as well as on our Facebook page, which we will put in the chat. So if you want to share that with any of your networks, please feel free to do so and have them join the conversation. So again, thanks to everyone. And until next time, have a wonderful weekend and best of luck for everything. Thank you.
Thank you.